Good morning, church. Happy Sabbath. We are going to sing Leaning on the Everlasting Arms. How many of you are thankful that we don't have to put our trust in ourselves, that we can lean on the everlasting arms of God? I am definitely thankful. Please sing with me.
Morning, everyone. Welcome to Sabbath School. It's time for our lesson study. Let's start with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for your many blessings. Thank you for your word. Thank you for sending Jesus to us. Thank you that he came to reveal you to us and to show us the way of salvation. Thank you for this time of year when we remember his birth. Be with us as we study your word this morning, that our eyes and hearts might be opened. I pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so do we have microphone man this morning? Okay. Before I start with my leading out of the lesson, I'd like to ask if anybody has something special that you noticed in the lesson this week that you'd like to share before we start. Does anybody have anything? All right. So, the lesson study, for any who looked at it, feels that the book of John is divided into 4 parts. They call it the prologue, the book of signs, the book of glory, and the epilogue. And today they're saying that we're starting the book of glory, but they start with a text from the prologue, and which is appropriate because they're wanting us to understand the significance of what Jesus is doing in the rest of our lesson today. And so we're going to read that together here. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. I'd like to look at that text for a minute this morning. Do any thoughts come to your mind when John makes a statement, no one has seen God at any time? At least two Old Testament stories come to my mind. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? John, up here, Mike. John says that no one has seen God at any time.
This might be more of the Son of God.
We're having the mic. Go ahead and try again there, Mike. Is it? Mic's not working here.
Testing.
There we go. Got it.
I know Nebuchadnezzar saw someone like the Son of God with three Hebrew
Okay.
children, but it's not God. And then Jacob said he came face to face with God.
Okay. All right.
God
Now-
said Moses said he talked face to face with God.
Yeah, and Moses asked to see God, and what did God say to him? No one can see my face and live. And so he said, but I'll let you see me from behind. Now, I'm not sure what that means because God is a spirit. But Moses received some kind of revelation of God, but it was partial, right? Obviously, because God said, if I reveal myself to you fully, you'll die. Now, Isaiah says that, you remember? He said that he saw the Lord high and lifted up, and then he says, woe is me. It's one of my favorite texts in the Bible. I love that text because Isaiah is just overwhelmed, and we would do well to have such a vision of God and such a feeling in his presence as woe is me, for I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, and mine eyes have seen the glory of the Lord. Okay, Donna.
Well, Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father.
Right. Okay, so Jesus then becomes the answer to at least one question, and that is, many questions, but one really important question, and that is, what would God be like if he was a man? Jesus is the answer to that question. What would God be like if he was a man? Because he was God who was a man. And so God cannot reveal to us exactly what he is in his glory, in his physical glory, what he is as God. But he can reveal to us in the glory of his character what he is as one of us. This is what he would be like. And not only that, but you remember Jesus says, no one has ascended up into heaven except the one who came down, right? And so I like to say without Jesus rather than until, because the benefits of the ministry and the death and resurrection of Jesus is for all time, not just after the cross. It was retroactive, if you will. But without that, there was only a one-way street from heaven to earth. And with the coming of the Savior, the path between heaven and earth becomes a two-way street. And so in that, Jesus reveals the glory of God, because God was and still is desperate to save us. And just how desperate he was is revealed in the gift of his Son. You have to be awfully desperate to do what God did, don't you? Yeah, you do. I mean, how many of you have ever given up one of your children to die for somebody? I mean, people will donate a kidney, but nobody lays down their life. I mean, we marvel at people that donate a kidney. It's a tremendous act of love, right? But or people that will donate part of their liver. We just marvel at these people, but God sent His Son to die for us. Now, it's interesting that as the lesson identifies the section of the Book of Glory, what does it start with? Did you notice? The Book of Glory starts with the story of Jesus washing His disciples' feet. How does this act reveal the glory of God? How does the act of Jesus washing the disciples' feet reveal the glory of God? Or does it? I think it does, but I'd like to hear what you have to say. Come on now. I know the cat's not got your tongue. Up front here. By the way, can somebody tell me, is there a special feature this morning? Can somebody look in the bulletin to tell me? I forgot to look before I got up here. There is. Okay, thank you. I want to make sure I get done in time. Go ahead.
I'm sure we're all familiar with the saying, actions speak louder than words. And so Jesus came to reveal His Father in His character and His actions and the things that He did. And it's easy for us to say to someone, I love you, but to actually show an act of love is a different story. And that's what Jesus did. He showed the act of love by doing the service that He did to His disciples with the foot washing.
Okay, Bonnie, right here, Mike.
Humility is a very glorious thing. To be so abased, like Philippians 2, starting as an equal of the Father, and yet not only down to the human, but to be considered a human that's guilty of all our sins and to die the worst possible death. There is no more gloriously beautiful trait of God to me than His humility. And it took His becoming human in Jesus for us to see that.
Okay, any other thoughts? It's interesting. Deborah.
Before Bonnie said that, my thought went to where he says, the first shall be last, and the last shall be first. And he was showing himself to be servant of all. And that humility that she's talking about came in that form, in that he would give up everything, and that is to the glory of God, so that we can be saved. And we become his glory in our salvation.
All right. In fact, the text says there in the second half of verse 13, of chapter 13, says, having loved His own who were in the world, He now showed them the full extent of His love. And even in the human realm, we understand that. How many times have you heard somebody describe somebody who's tremendously intelligent or tremendously skilled or tremendously talented or whatever, and the next thing out of the word is, but they're so down to earth, right? That combination of greatness and humility is just loved. Everybody loves that. And everybody despises the opposite. I mean, it can almost be humorous. I have a friend who had a very long, drawn-out, horrible medical problem. And she initially was told that she's going to have her foot amputated because of this problem. And she went to see this doctor who's supposed to be one of the best doctors at treating these kind of problems. And he's a plastic surgeon and involved doing this very specialized operation of moving tissue around. And so she goes and sees him. This is a story of the opposite. And it's so bad, like I said, it's humorous. She goes to see the guy, and he says, I can save your foot. And so my friend, she doesn't, she's very direct in her community, says, well, how come you think you can save my foot, and all these other people are telling me that I need to just go on and get it over with and have it amputated? And he says, oh, he's not the man, I am. And this is just, he was so arrogant. But fortunately, she doesn't have any problem with it. She could just talk right back to him. In fact, when she was in the hospital, her communication with him was so direct and so to the point and so cutting through his arrogance that the director of the nurses on this unit, where he always put his patients, lived in fear of this guy. And the head nurse could not believe what he was doing for this, my friend who was his patient. She'd never seen him do this before. So anyway, but then the opposite. Now, I'm not trying to set myself up as anything, wonderful or anything, but I've noticed at work, it just, in our society, it's the way it is. In my workplace, doctors tend to be at the top of the totem pole. That's the way it is, whether it should be or not, it just is. I'm an emergency doctor. And I never got over the fact that I was a resident. And when you're a resident, you're at the bottom of the totem pole. And so when you're a resident, you do what we call scut work. You do all the stuff that nobody else wants to do. So I was training as a surgeon. And so the thing you do is, you push especially at the hospital where I was my first year, you push the patient on the gurney into the operating room. You help move them over onto the table. You scrub them and get them ready for the surgeon to operate on them. When they're done, you take them off the table and you push the gurney back to the recovery room. And you do the note that tells, you do all the stuff that would normally be done if you weren't residents there, would be done by other paid personnel. And so I got used to it, and that's what I've always done. I don't think anything about it. And so where I work, if a patient needs to go to a CAT scan and the techs are busy, I just push them myself. And if the bed isn't made, I put the sheet on. And if the techs need some help, I'll help the techs. And I've learned all their names pretty much, working with everything. And so I've always had a really good relationship with the techs. They seem to like me, to the point that one day I was in with a patient and I got done, and we have private rooms now with sliding glass doors, but there's a curtain. And so I tripped coming out of the room and fell through the curtain out into the hallway. And I don't know if I went clear to the floor, but I almost fell all the way down. And one of the techs comes over there, literally ready to put up his dukes and take on whoever the person was that had pushed me out of the room into the hall. And, that really touched me, that the guy cared that much about me that he was ready to go to battle for me, if somebody touched my dock. It was pretty funny. He and I have laughed about that ever since, because I just tripped, but he couldn't see what had happened on the other side of the curtain. And so, as I say, this is a small kind of humorous example, but it in a small way, we catch this vision that Jesus is worthy of our worship. He's worthy of our loyalty. He's worthy of our obedience. And yet he stoops to do the most lowly of tasks. He stoops to wash their feet. I don't know what to compare it to today, He stoops to take out the garbage. He stoops to change the diaper. He stoops to clean up the patient who's got vomit and poop all over them. Jesus, there is nothing that Jesus is not willing to do for us. And so in this, he shows us the glory of his Father, that he has all these things, but willingly lays them aside. He's tremendously talented. He's tremendously skilled. He's tremendously powerful. But it, quote, doesn't go to his head, right? He says, I didn't come to be served. I came to serve. And how radically different that is from our view of life. We want to get to the easier position. We want to climb up the ladder, to where you have people working for you instead of working for other people and so on. There's nothing wrong with human ambition, but it's just so marvelous what Jesus was and is willing to do for us. Colleen.
Yeah, what you're saying, it just makes me marvel too, and it just makes me ponder what Jesus meant and understand at a deeper level that he said true greatness is serving. We have it reversed here on this earth. We've been prideful and wanting to be recognized and wanting all these things for ourselves, but true greatness is not in that status. It's in serving, and so I think that's where God's glory is, as you were saying.
Okay. The other thing that I think we really particularly need to take notice, that John is very specific. He introduces the subject. He says, I'm getting ready to tell you the story of how Jesus demonstrated the full extent of his love. And then the first thing he says before he talks about Jesus washing the disciples' feet is he said that he knew that Judas had already decided to betray him. And John is making the point that Jesus is going to wash the feet of his betrayer. John's being very specific before he even starts the story. So we know the story. They're all there at the table, and perhaps they're all thinking, well, boy, my feet sure are tired and sore and dirty and sweaty and smelly from the road today. Who's going to wash? And the next thing they know, Jesus gets up and he wraps a towel around his waist. And at first they were probably puzzled, why is he getting up? Because they had arranged the supper, right? He'd sent a couple of them ahead, and they had rented the room, and they had this experience of him knowing exactly, telling them where to go and that they would be shown the room. And sure enough, this is sort of, I can just imagine, remember now that, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Jews from all over the world have come to Jerusalem for this weekend, and they all need a place to celebrate the Passover. And I don't think when we talk about this story, we marvel enough at the fact, this is like going into a city where all the hotel rooms are taken, and miraculously one opens up. Jesus knew there was one room left that nobody had reserved. Maybe there had been a reservation that had fallen through. I don't know. But he says that he'll show you an upper room that's prepared and furnished, right? I am assuming this is sort of their version of Airbnb. This guy did this. He probably made money. This is, at these festivals is when he makes his money for the year, is when people want to rent his room. And yet Jesus knows with all these people coming and there's no place to stay, there's no place to celebrate Passover, there's one left. And here's how you find it. So they go and find it, and now they're at dinner, and they're there. There's no servant, so there's no one to wash their feet. And if something has been forgotten, one of them should be getting up to take care of it, right? And so I'm sure at first they didn't know what Jesus was doing. And my guess is their first inkling is when he wrapped the towel around his waist. And I can imagine they're sort of like, no, he's not going to do that, is he? Right? And then they see him get a basin of water, and they're like, he is going to do that. And I don't know why one of them didn't try to stop him before he started. Maybe they were too shocked. Any of you ever been in a situation where you didn't know what to say, and so you couldn't say anything, right? You're so shocked, you don't know what to do, you don't know how to react, and I'm sure that's what they were doing. And so he starts, and then we know the story. He comes to Peter, right? Now, we kind of chuckle at Peter, but Peter is like, to me, Peter is the New Testament David. He's so passionate about God. He's so passionate that he tends to be a little impetuous. That's the way David was. You remember, David, there was nothing halfway about David. David was either all in or all out. Somebody insults his men, he girds up his guys, and he's going to go kill him, right? Wouldn't they? Abigail's husband, make sure I get the right name. Naboth, thank you. I knew it was something, and I know it's not Nathan. That's a difference. So Naboth, and that's the way, and when it comes time to build the temple, David says, Lord, I want to build the temple. He says, no, you can't do that. And so he says, okay, but there's nothing that says I can't contribute. There's nothing that says I can't get everything ready. I can't build it, but I can do all the prep work. And so this, Peter is David in the New Testament. And so Peter says, no, Lord, you're not doing that. I'm not allowing, you're not going to humiliate yourself. Humble's one thing, humiliated's another. And I'm not going to let you do it. And Jesus says, look, you don't understand. Jesus is so gentle. He appreciates Peter's protest, right? Jesus doesn't rebuke him. He says, look, you don't understand what I'm doing now, but you will later. And then Peter crosses the line. And he says, no, you're never going to do that. And then Jesus has to rebuke him. And he says, if I don't wash you, you have no part in me. And then Peter is beside himself, because if there's one thing Peter cannot face, it would be life without Christ. And this is it with Peter. It's like I say, he's like David. He's all in. You look at, I'm puzzled sometimes. What is it? It's like David could not get rid of God, no matter how hard he tried, because David loved God. For all his foibles, David loved God. And Peter, for all his impetuousness and for all his mistakes, he loved Jesus. He loved him in a way that none of the other disciples did. And so when Jesus tells him, if I don't wash your feet, you have no part of me, he says, well then wash my feet and wash everything. I'm all in. And Jesus said, no, don't need to do that. Just need to wash your feet. And so Peter consents, and then Jesus finishes, including washing Judas's feet. And you can imagine how Judas felt. I believe Ellen White describes that in Desire of Ages. And then when he gets done, it says when he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place, sort of like as if nothing had happened. He just, remember what Jesus said? When a man comes in at the end of the day and his servant comes in from the field, does he set the table for him? He says, no. He says, first go fix my meal and then you can eat. And then he says, when you have done what you were supposed to do, what are we supposed to say? Remember? I've simply done my duty, right? And this is the way Jesus is. This is what his attitude here. He says, well, there was no one else to do it, so I did it. He doesn't make a big deal out of it. He just sits back down. But he wants them to understand. He says, this is not something one-off. He said, you need to understand what I just did. And what were they supposed to understand about it? What was the significance? We've talked about the other, but what is the significance that Jesus specifically says of what he did? He said, you're supposed to treat each other the same way I just treated you. And that means no matter what our station in life, no matter what our situation, we are to treat every one of God's children as a superior, according to what Jesus set an example here. Who is the superior and who is the inferior in the relationship of somebody washing another person's feet? Who's the superior, the person washing or the person being washed? The person being washed. So Jesus is humbling himself below the level of his disciples. And he's telling us the same thing, that we are to regard ourselves as the least of God's children, and we are to relate. This is not something nice that we say in Sabbath school or at church on Sabbath morning. This is the way we're actually supposed to conduct our lives. This is the way we're supposed to put one foot in front of the other, as if everyone else was our superior and we are their servant. I hope all of us find that a challenge this morning, because if we're not finding it a challenge, we're not hearing what Jesus is saying. And I know as I say it this morning, I'm finding it a challenge right now as I say this. This is the way God expects me to live, moment by moment, day by day, the way Jesus lived that night in the upper room. And so that Jesus reveals the glory of God in this way. Now, then he goes on later in the chapter. This passage, he's beginning to say goodbye to his disciples. And the lesson talks about how this is somewhat like when Jacob said goodbye to his sons, and other stories in the scripture where people have come to the end of their lives, and so they're saying goodbye. And I've thought about that. There are some things I want to say to my children, because we all could die 2 minutes from now, but as you get older, you start thinking about these things, because when you're 20, death seems a long ways away. When you're 67, it doesn't seem so far. And those of you who are maybe in 70s, 80s, I don't know if anybody's in their 90s here this morning, but I'm sure death is seeming closer all the time. And you begin to think about, what do I want to leave behind? Not in the way of material things, but in the way of spiritual things. And what do I want my children to know that's important to me? And so this is what Jesus is doing. And, I've thought about some of the things. I don't know. I tried telling my one daughter something one time, and it was just more than she could handle. She just ignored me. She didn't mean to. It's just that she wasn't prepared for it, and she just couldn't handle it. The idea of Dad telling me what could happen to him when he gets older, I'm not ready for that. So I'll try again sometime, but I thought about maybe writing a letter. We talk about a will, but what about a spiritual will? What do we want? Maybe our children won't listen to us now, but if you put it in the envelope with your will, they have to read it at least once, right? And this is what Jesus is doing. Jesus is basically, in these next chapters here, he is writing out a will, if you will. He's writing out his last testament to his disciples. And so he comes down and he says to them, I'm going somewhere now. Now, why do you think Jesus wouldn't tell them where he was going? Anybody have any thoughts on that? Why didn't he just spell it out for them? Why does Jesus, with his disciples, so often seem to speak in riddles? He is the revelation of God, and yet there are so many things where he doesn't seem to quite say exactly what he's thinking. And here's what I'm hearing. He says, I'm going somewhere where you can't go. Well, what's their natural response? Well, where are you going? And why can't we go with you? We've gone with you everywhere you've been for the last 3 years, and now you're saying you're going somewhere we can't go. Right? And does Jesus answer their question? No, he doesn't, does he? Look at it here. He says, and Peter says, Lord, where are you going? And Jesus says, where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Yeah, Peter didn't know himself, did he? And I'm afraid that's true of all of us. And thankfully we have a Lord to warn us. So Jesus says, will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the rooster crows, you will disown me 3 times. And it just went right over Peter's head. And I just wonder how many times the things that God says to us just right over our heads, because we're just not ready to listen. And in this story, this is just a brief interlude, and then the story goes on. And Peter would have done well to have, instead of worrying about where Jesus is going to go, say, what? Wait a minute. And later he does protest. And Jesus tries to tell him, listen to me. I'm warning you. This is what's coming. And Jesus tried to protect him from it. He tried to save him from it. He in my line of business, we call this prophylaxis. He was trying to prevent this thing from happening by warning Peter that this is what he was going to do. But then he tells them, he says, look, you can't go where I'm going. I'm going, and you can't come with me, which means that they're going to be without Jesus now, right? They've been with him for 3.5 years. They've served him as their Lord and Master. And now all of a sudden he's saying, I'm going away and you can't go with me. And he doesn't answer their question about where he's going, but he does do something better. And this is a way of faith. We need to understand this. It is better to trust God than to understand what's coming. Right? It is better to trust God than to understand what's coming or why things are happening or anything else. That's why the Scripture speaks of the peace that passes understanding. Not that we can't understand such peace, it's the peace is better than understanding. It is better to have peace and to be at peace, trusting God, than to understand why what is happening. People right now are getting themselves all worked up and worried about what's coming on the earth, right? They look at the political scene especially, and they're all worried and fretful and terrified and everything else. My friends, that's not the life of faith. That's the way the world lives. The way we live is, let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions, or in his house there are many rooms. If it were not so, this to me is a fascinating statement. Have you ever thought about this? If it were not so, I would have told you that. There are a lot of things Jesus isn't telling them, including where he's not going, but he says, I promise you that if there was not room for you in my Father's house, I would have told you. That's an amazing, I don't know, there's something about that statement that just fascinates me, that Jesus makes that specific thing. I go to prepare a place for you. You can't come with me now. You can't see the place I'm preparing. But you can come later after I have it ready. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go, I will come again and take you to be with me forever. What a promise. That's better than knowing where Jesus is going, right? And better than knowing what's coming is to be able to have confidence that God will take us through. And so then Thomas naturally says, they're still going to know, he's still thinking like a man, right? He's still got his human thinking cap on. They still haven't made the transition to thinking spiritually. And he's thinking very concretely. And so, and in fact, because Jesus has just said, you know the place where I am going. He just told them, they've already asked him where he's going, and he doesn't answer them, but he says, you know where I'm going. Or at least you know the place. Maybe that's what he's saying. You don't realize that's where I'm going, but you do know the place where I'm going. They knew that there's a heaven, and they know there's a God that dwells in the heavens, right? So they know the place where he's going. They just don't realize that's where he's going. And so then Thomas says, but Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? It's kind of a logical question if you're thinking like, using human reasoning, right? But Jesus is trying to get them to where they're no longer using just ordinary, unspiritually enlightened human reason and start to begin spiritual thinking. And this is the struggle that each of us faces today. Too often we just think with our human reasoning. We don't think with spiritual reasoning as the Word of God reveals it to us. And so Thomas says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? And so Jesus says, I am the way. Isn't that reassuring? So, how many of you know exactly what's going to happen to you in the next week? None of us knows, right? We sure don't know what's going to happen to us in the next 5 years, next 10 years. So isn't it wonderful to know the way? We don't need to know where we're going, right? We just need to know the way. As long as we are in the way, not, in the way, but in the way, that's good enough. We don't even need to know where the way is going. We just need to be in the way. We need to be in Christ. And wherever He takes us is fine. Does it matter where we go as long as we're with Christ? No. It may be easy, it may be hard. It may be joyful, it may be sad. It may be fun, it may be miserable. But as long as we are with Christ, it doesn't matter. Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. So with Jesus, we know where to go. We don't know where we're going, but we know where to go. We know the truth, and we have life. In fact, we have life eternal in Jesus. And then he says this, says, if you really knew me, you would know my Father as well. From now on, you do know him and have seen him. And again, we look at the disciples and we say, how could they miss this? Well, I will tell you how they could miss it, because we are just like the disciples, and we miss it. We just don't realize we're missing it, because the disciples didn't realize they were missing it. These things were written for us for examples. They weren't meant for us to look at those disciples. That Peter, he was just always mouthing off, always getting it wrong. Thank God I'm not like that, right? We stand in the temple like the priest and the Pharisee, and we thank God that we're not like other men. We thank God we're not like those disciples. We know better than that. We would never do that. Morivenda was so right. He says, you're not the publican in that story until you realize you're the Pharisee. If you don't see yourself in the Pharisee, you haven't become the publican yet. So keep reading that story until you become to the conviction that you're a Pharisee, praying to God and thanking him. You're not like the disciples were. And so then Philip says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. And it's sort of like Jesus goes, 3.5 years, Philip. 3.5 years I've been showing you the Father. And you don't have any idea that's what I've been doing. Philip, what did you think I've been doing all this time? I've been showing you the Father. How on earth can you say, show us the Father? Don't you know who I am? Now Peter knew the formula, right? You remember? Jesus said, who am I? And Peter says, you're the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus tells him, flesh has not revealed this to you. You didn't figure this out on your own. And the Holy Spirit has enlightened your mind. So a little bit of the rays of dawn had begun to shine, but there was no way it doesn't even seem like the sun had come over the horizon yet. It's still twilight, spiritual twilight for at least some of the disciples. And Jesus says, anyone who has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? Don't you believe that I am the Father and that the Father is in me? The words I say to you are not just my own. Rather, it is the Father living in me who is doing his work. Believe me when I say that I am in the Father and the Father is in me. Or at least believe on the evidence of the miracles themselves. you sense a little bit of desperation in Jesus' voice here, but also patience. You know, God will take us any way He can get us. You know, He does that. We're going to talk about it later this morning. In Malachi, you know, when He's urging the people to bring their tithes and offerings, which they haven't been doing. And He tells them, you know, look, and all through the Old Testament, He tells people that the problem when you don't serve Me is your heart. You've got to serve Me with your heart. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart. And you got to do that. But He says, look, if you won't bring Me tithe and offerings because you love Me, can we at least start with a business deal? You bring your tithe and offering. Yeah, sure. I'll be right there. Where? Okay, I'll be right there. He said that, and I'm sorry, folks. They need me to go. Is there anybody who wants to take over?
I'll be here for a second. We just had an emergency that he needs to attend to. So, where are we? Let's see. It looks like he's on Tuesday with I Am the Way, the Truth, and the Life. Okay. What was that? Show us the Father. Oh. How is the Father revealed? What's that? Through His Son, through Jesus. Is there more than one way to Jesus? I am the way, the truth, and the life. Did you see recently where the Pope was telling everybody that every religion has a way to God? Does that fit? No, probably not. Jesus reveals the Father, and He came to do that for us.
What he was saying was, Jesus must have said,
I got the mic here.
He was saying, Jesus must have been saying, when the disciple says, show us the Father, He's like, really? I've been with you 3.5 years here. That's what I've been trying to do. And you're asking me to show you the Father? I think that's where the frustration that Jesus had was, that's what I've been doing. It's like, are you hungry? Well, I've been feeding you. And you're saying that where's the food? It's just an interesting thing.
In the Old Testament, I'm switching gears. I'm trying to find a way to go forward here, and I was right in the middle of doing something different, and that's why my head is a little split. But there's a passage in Ezekiel chapter 36 where Israel. Well, let me start the story from Isaiah chapter 1. In Isaiah chapter 1, God berates or He reproves Israel for the ceremonies and for the things that they were doing, which were offering lambs and sacrifices and incense. So God reproves them for doing that. Why would God reprove someone for doing the things that He told them to do? Yes. Deborah. Mike? Mike?
If they raise their hands, it makes it easier.
Got to put it up there and put a flag on it.
I think he does that when we do it without understanding. It becomes something that's rote now. And we're doing it just to do it. We come to church just because we need to come to church. But what's the purpose of coming to church? What's the purpose of coming to Sabbath school? Are you giving him your full allegiance with understanding? And they had gotten to a point where it was just a form and sacrifice, and let's bring all this stuff and more and more and more. And he's like, I'm sick and tired of it. I can't stand what you're doing now because it's without understanding why you are doing it. And you need to come to me with that knowledge.
That's really good, because in Isaiah chapter 1, verses 10 to 12 is the verses that I was thinking of. And it says in verse 10, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Well, who's he really talking to? Is he talking to Sodom here in Isaiah 10? He's talking to Israel. And he's talking to them, and he says, I've had enough of your burnt offerings and rams and fat and your meaningless new moons and Sabbaths, and they're detestable to me. But then, like Deborah said, down in verse 18, it says what? Come now and let us reason together. Do it by engaging your mind. Don't do it just rote. And yeah, go ahead, Colleen.
And maybe it was rote because, well, they had lost the meaning and their heart was far from God. Their heart, they weren't repentant. They would bring the lamb, but they weren't really repentant.
Right.
And so there was no meaning, and they thought they knew God when they didn't. So it was like a fake, pretentious relationship.
And interestingly, interestingly, the problem was that Israel was going through these things, and when you looked at it from the outside, they were representing who? They were representing God. But were they really representing God? Yeah, not by their action. Well, yeah. Look at Ezekiel chapter 36. Ezekiel chapter... Boy, I'm going to have a hard time finding it. Yeah, it's in verse 19, I think. Yes. Yes.
No, I was just going to add on to what Deborah and Colleen said. It could even be, it was fear that if they didn't bring the sacrifice, oh no, I'm going to get punished. I mean, how many times as children have we said sorry because it was not because we were sorry, but because we didn't want the punishment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, okay, another comment.
In the first 3 or so pages of Christ Object Lessons, it says that Jesus was so sick of the way the Jews had twisted everything he gave them, the Old Testament, the sacrificial system, the meaning of the symbols, that he just practically was ready to throw it all out, and he started teaching parables in place of talking more about what they were already doing every day without any heart love for him. But the first 3 pages of Christ's Object Lessons are very interesting.
Yeah. That's good. The problem with Israel, now in Isaiah, 1 and Ezekiel 16 and Ezekiel 36, Israel is being compared to Sodom and Gomorrah, right? And in fact, in Ezekiel 16, it says that they are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, why would Israel be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah? They had the truth to begin with. In very stark terms. Yes.
I don't know if I have my timeline right, but I wondered about that. How could they be worse? Is it because at this point of time, they are now sacrificing their children, burning them and killing them? Is it the timeline that they are carving the idols and reacting with them? This is terrible to think of, sexually, as though the idols were alive. Is that kind of where we are on the timeline that makes them worse?
That was taking place at this time. That is true. I think there had been instances prior to that of child sacrifice among Israel. And that's why God was saying they are worse than Sodom and Gomorrah. Now here's, verse 23, Ezekiel chapter 36, verse 23, it says that I will show the holiness of my great name, which has been profaned among the nations. The name that you have profaned among them. Now, why would Ezekiel say that God's name had been profaned, and why would Israel be worse than Sodom and Gomorrah? Because, let me ask it this way, if a single woman goes out to become a prostitute, that's bad. But if a married woman goes out to be a prostitute, is that worse? Yeah, and what makes it worse? She was already professing a certain commitment to someone else. Israel had professed an engagement with God, and yet they were doing the opposite. Mike?
What's worse, a hypocrite or a sinner?
Yeah. It's true, and yet God is making this comparison where he is, Gary, please come forward, rescue me. I took them off on another tangent, but
Well, it's time to wrap up anyway, because
Yeah.
we do have a special feature. Thank you, Frederick.
thank you.
Oh, you're welcome.
Is it my turn?
What's that?
I say, is it my turn? Mike just handed this.
Go ahead.
Well, I got a theory about, I don't think it's a big percentage, but especially anciently as opposed to today's economy. Some of those women that were married or not went out to be a prostitute because they wanted to feed their kids and they couldn't see any other way to do it. So that should be looked at a little differently.
Okay, well, just some good news. The emergency has passed by, and it looks like the person's going to be okay. So, sorry, I couldn't finish my sentence. I got a little too distracted. I was trying to finish it before I ran off. Anyway, I just wanted to close with the lesson author points out that there are a number of Jesus' statements here where he says, I am this, I am that. We covered the one, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And then he'll say other things like, I am the good shepherd, and so on. Now, I know nothing about the Greek language, and so I don't know if there's any other way to say I am other than I am, the way we translate I am. But you remember the most important I am statement that Jesus made was, before Abraham was, I am. And in that statement, obviously, he is claiming to be the God of the Old Testament, which, when you stop and think about it, is an amazing, how could he be that confident? He had grown up as a man, and yet he knows who he is, and so he makes that statement. So as you read through the rest of the lessons, whenever you come to a statement of I am this, I am that, I want us to remember this statement that before Abraham I was, I am, and remember that each of these I am statements is a revelation not only of who Jesus is, but who the Father is. Okay, Dan. Do you need this? Okay.
I'll stay tethered. So we'll do, again, just a quick summary of the presentation that happened last Sabbath for Vespers. And this category of health was on coping with stress. So a very simple kind of statement there to start off with. Stress is just the price we pay for being alive. You might say stress is endemic to life. And stress, you might also say, is necessary for life, right? You look at how a tree grows. A tree will grow stronger if it is given certain stresses and so on. Where I grew up, there were a lot of very old juniper trees, and they were kind of, to me, very artistic because they would have these twists and turns, and they would grow around rocks and boulders and things like that. And you could tell that their whole shape had been determined by types of stress. And so it's not necessarily a negative term as we often think of it. It is simply what we have to respond to if we're going to be alive. You can't escape it for sure, but you can take charge of it by your thoughts and emotions. So this is working toward the idea that stress is, as we think of it individually, is something that actually is inside of us. It's not inherent in the environment. It is our reaction to what's happening externally. It's a result of, or modifiable by how you choose to make your schedule and your commitments. For me, that's a big one. I have a hard time saying no. So I end up with a lot more stress at sometimes in my life because I didn't make the right response at the right time. And then, of course, the way you actually individually respond to stress. Those are all critical parts of how stress will end up affecting you internally. So the goal basically is to have a balanced life when it comes to stress and to develop ultimately a resilience to the types of stresses that you have to handle. So stress being the response to any demand placed upon the body and the general wear and tear of daily living comes from stressors, demands, and events in situations that require a proper response. And then there's the good stress, which is beneficial to life and goals. For me, I'm a very easygoing, laid-back kind of person. And so I would say literally my brain doesn't work well until I have to stand up here in front of people and actually do something that's supposed to be constructive. For some reason, that kind of stresses me out a little bit, and I actually feel like I get more blood flow to my brain when I'm in this kind of a situation, and my brain works better because of it. So I have to have that kind of stress in order to perform my best. If I didn't, I would be way too laid back and not getting much of anything done. So eustress for me is something that's very important and critical, and that was true for me in school as well with my grades. I had to have a certain amount of stress put on me to do my best academically as well. Then there's distress, so the stress that has more of a direct destructive effect on our mental, physical, and emotional health. And that's what we have to learn to mitigate very effectively in our life. So stresses come in routine forms. Work, relationships, could be financial, environmental, sudden negative life changes. Those are the ones we can't predict, and those are the hard ones because we can feel like we're going along just fine, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere comes this big stress that can throw us out of balance. And that's where we would hope to have built up in advance of these types of things, kind of like saving up for a rainy day. We want to have a good resilience built up before such things happen. But I don't know that we'll ever feel like we actually could or did when such things come upon us. And those can take the form of traumatic situations, such as a lot of us have probably confronted in the course of our life. Along those lines, too, we know, incidentally, right, that sometime in the near future there's coming a time of trouble such as never was. So we have good advance warning that there are going to be some major stressors coming our way that we need to be preparing for very wisely. So stress is additive. It's not like you can necessarily, the body doesn't separate in its total stress response. All the accumulated, maybe small things like the straw that breaks the camel's back add up and comprise the whole experience of stress in the body. So again, because we can't completely avoid it, we want to keep it under manageable limits and balance in that regard. Stress is subjective. It's not out there. It's actually within us. So you take 2 or 3 individuals, put them through the same experience, they're going to experience very likely very different responses internally to that stressor. So the basic kind of sequence of events looks like this. There's a stressor, and then there's your response. That's going to be dictated by all of the things that make you who you are, a complex set of variables. And then the coping skills that you bring into that response. And then that's going to determine ultimately whether that stressor goes in the direction of a eustress, a productive, beneficial effect on your life, or into a distressful experience, an ultimately kind of negative experience that would, for example, depress your immune system for a period of time. That would be an example of a negative effect in the body. So there's a number of specific things that happen in our body. We all can verify this very easily when we have a fight or flight response, right? If I have a near collision on the freeway, all of a sudden, boom, heart rate's going to go up. I have stress hormones that are released and go into my circulation. I have blood glucose that's going to be increased for a period of time. My energy is shifted very quickly. I can actually start to shake a little bit and have a nervous system as well as muscle response. And then in a cascade of events, my immune system will be activated in a very different way than what it was before I had that stress. And this is, to a lesser degree, what also happens in chronic stress. So if we shift from like a fight or flight response into something more of just a chronic day-to-day, maybe more low-grade stress, also the same thing will happen just to a less extreme degree. Your blood pressure will remain elevated. Your blood fats and cholesterol profiles will continue to stay higher, and glucose levels as well. The immune system becomes suppressed, so you have a decreased immunity against viruses and bacterial infection. We'll see an image of that in a second. You have a poor antibody response, slower wound healing, and then a higher inflammation within your body, which means anything that caused you to have any pain, like an injury, will actually hurt more than it otherwise would have when you're in that state in your immune system. So a little kind of a stress quiz. When you're under stress, your body sends signals. How many stress signals do you have? Check these boxes if they apply. Minor problems seem overwhelming. I feel nervous. I worry about many things. Can't stop thinking about my problems. Feel frustrated or angry much of the time. Tense much of the time. Sometimes find it hard to go to sleep. Probably on a more consistent than irregular basis. I think all of us at times will have times where we have a harder time going to sleep than others, but if that's pervasive, that's going to be more of an issue. Often feel tired and have very little energy, and that can, as well, and it's more day-to-day, can have a much more of a build-up effect on life, quality of life. So because in the previous week, we know that the mind and the body are so closely linked, the constant mental worries take a toll on physical health, contributing to a host of diseases. One of the mechanisms is through the immune system, like we mentioned, and on the other, what would you call, vitals of quality of life, like your blood pressure, blood glucose. So the effect of these things on the body will be multiple symptoms: headaches, backache, sleep disturbances, fatigue, worry, burnout, Low productivity, usually kind of a period of time that follows something like a burnout experience. Apathy, same thing that follows in the wake there. Trouble having good relationships, and that is a major problem because good relationships should be one of the reservoirs that you have against stress. And then health-related problems that grow out of these things, anxiety and depression, digestive problems. These are digestive problems are so ubiquitous out there. Many, probably the majority of the patients that I see in my care have some form of digestive problem, even though they're there maybe in the hospital for some completely what would seem to be a different cause. Catch more colds, so sleep problems, weight gain, hypertension, high blood pressure, heart disease, memory and concentration impairment. So that can be obviously subtle or more obvious, but that can start out very subtle in its early stages. So here's a very remarkable, to me, indication of how potently this affects your immune system. In this study, the level of stress was assessed in 200 healthy people. Then they were exposed to cold viruses and followed for 1 week. I don't know if I would have volunteered for that study, but they were exposed. The result was psychological stress was associated with an increased risk of acute infectious respiratory illness, in other words, a cold, in a dose-response manner. The risk was attributable to increased rates of infection. So it wasn't attributable necessarily to something else. They somehow controlled for those variables. And you can see how closely those two lines trend together. So how much effect your state of stress has on your susceptibility to an infectious process. Okay, I'm going to skip through some of these and get right through to resilience. The good things. What do we do to fight stress? I think we all have heard many times the negative effects of stress. So let's get to the listing of some of the good stuff here. The positive, let's go through that positive side real quick. Take responsibility and control. Set your priorities and delegate. If I remember my dad saying that, got to set your priorities. Limit demands. Learn to say no. Take one thing at a time. Balance, my dad's statement for that would have been, you got to grab the bull by the horns. Balance stress with relaxation. Take care of your health, get adequate rest, regular physical activity, and regular healthy meals. We've gone over those in our other talks. All these things strengthen and support multiple systems in the body, including your immune system. The balance between rest and physical activity, I would say, is a very important one, as well as sleep is right there in the mix. I kind of put sleep on the opposite side of the coin as physical activity. It's something that you do with your body that needs to be adequate and timely. And if you lack it on a daily basis, there's going to be an immediate effect in the next 24 hours on your health in multiple ways. Your mental clarity, your mood, the energy that you bring, as well as blood sugar levels and your overall sense of how stressed and able you are to handle stress that comes your way. We're not going to go through 10 reasons, but we'll just kind of summarize them very quickly. Adopt a healthy lifestyle, everything we've talked about and I just mentioned. Don't overcommit, we already mentioned that. Simplify your life, okay? A lot of times, at least for me, the last probably 10 years of my life, I would say one way I could summarize it has been trying to just simplify as much as possible. Focus on doing the things that I can do best and not worry about things that detract me from that. Learn to relax. It's harder for some of us than others, okay? But the relaxation is a mandatory part of health when it's needed. Be physically active, okay? The opposite aspect of that. Again, walking, one of the best exercises you can do, or a similar exercise that gets your heart rate up and gets you active in all your muscle groups of the body. Any exercise like that will have benefits. Be good to yourself. So if we look at Jesus' response to the most important commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself. What's implied there is that you have an appropriate estimation of yourself. And our greatest value, of course, is the price that's been paid for us, right? And so we want to remind ourselves of that often. We've been bought with a price, and we were deemed worthy of that price to be paid, and so we want to live up to that estimation in our life. Feed your emotional life, Okay, this is something I think especially for us males that takes a little more intentionality. But we need balance in the emotional realm every bit as much or even more than we do in the physical realm in order to have balance in our stress coping ability as well as in our physical health. Learn to resolve conflicts. Again, for me, that's an area that's difficult. I avoid conflicts, if at all possible, as often as possible. And I've had to learn over the last 20 years in my career to handle conflicts in much more constructive ways. I have had to learn to be more forthright and direct when necessary, to be able to confront with what needs to happen in a given time span. And I still have a lot to learn with that. For others, it's not so hard. People who are what I call a prophet gifting don't have any problem speaking the truth. And their problem is actually understanding that they may step on people's toes more than necessary when they speak the truth. So understanding your personality, your gifting will help in that regard to have a balance in your interpersonal relationships and making sure that conflict doesn't linger longer than necessary or have more fallout consequences than is necessary. Keeping overall balance, okay, we've already emphasized, but I like the way that they put this list here. Work with recreation, weariness with rest, disappointment with hope, worry with trust, stress with relaxation, doubt with optimism, excitement with quiet times, loneliness with friendship, and rush with serenity, and clutter with order. I like that last one. Okay, I think we'll stop there. There's obviously a lot more that was said, but next week's topic. Today is mind and body. So mind and body, this evening's talk will be on. Thank you.